You're listening to the Outdoors Channel.
Who?
What? Yeah! Woo!
I think it's a splendid idea.
Hello and welcome back to the Outdoors Station. Yes, the Outdoors Station. A new name which we've had to adopt due to legal reasons. Over the next few weeks, our website and content will be rebranded, ready for a fresh launch in 2007. You'll find us over at theoutdoorstation.co.uk very soon. So, don't worry, we haven't gone away, we're just rebranding, and we'll be back at full strength very soon. In the meantime, book club host Andy Howell has been holding it all together and been working away with some exciting new interviews. So sit back and enjoy an interview with Martin Wainwright in a coffee shop somewhere in the UK.
Welcome to a two-part special of the book club. One of the bestsellers of 2005-2006 was A Lifetime of Mountains, the best of A. Harry Griffin's country diaries, originally published in the Guardian newspaper over a record-breaking 50-year period. The diaries have been lovingly put together by Martin Wainwright, the Guardian's northern editor. Recently, I caught up with Martin to talk not only about A Lifetime of Mountains, but also about a second collection of Guardian diaries, A Gleaming Landscape, that's recently been published to great acclaim. But first, we sat down amongst the hustle and bustle of the Leeds Art Gallery Cafe to talk about Harry Griffin and his love of the lakes. Now, I've got a confession to make. I'm a Guardian reader through and through, and probably will be until the day that I die. What I like about The Guardian is its mix of modernity and tradition, and there's no finer Guardian tradition than the country diary, that exquisitely crafted piece of writing that appears every day in The Guardian, and it has done for over 100 years or so. The great runaway success for me in book publishing last year was the first of two compilations of Guardian diaries, and I'm delighted to be sitting here in Leeds with Martin Wainwright, the northern editor of The Guardian, who's compiled these two collections. Martin, welcome.
It's very nice to be here, Andy.
Now, I suppose there might be a few people out there who don't read The Guardian, perish the thought, and who don't know about the country diaries. So can you just give us a flavour about them and just why they're so fantastically wonderful?
Yeah, no, I'd be delighted. It is, I think, the longest running column in British journalism, and Harry Griffin, who I did this collection last year of his diaries, he himself alone did it for 53 years, and that was a record, I think, except there was a woman on something like the Peterborough Evening Standard who did a kind of children's corner who just beat him, I think just pipped him to the record. But the country diary has been going for 102 years now, and It's fascinating to read the way it's changed and the way it's kind of described our changing countryside. One of the sort of original entries that amazed me, and I suppose it's a criticism of myself really, I hadn't kind of thought about this, it was a description, going back a bit to the author's youth, of when the railways came to Britain, or when they really took off in the sort of later part of the 19th century. And I did that at school and so on, but I never realised what this guy was writing about was that the coming of the railways killed villages all over the country, because all those old coaching inns where we now go, and have a meal out and go and have a drink in a beautiful country pub, for a period between the arrival of the railways and the arrival of the motor car, which was another revolution, they were empty, they were boarded up. This guy said the countryside looked as though it had been ravaged by an invading army, because all the people who used to travel through the countryside suddenly were all going by train. And so it's insights like that which are really fascinating, I think. Plus, of course, a wonderful nature observation. Everything from dolphins to otters to... Well, there's the deepest one ever written, was a country diary that was done at the bottom of the coal mine at Monk Wearmouth on Tyneside. And Phil Gates, the lecturer at Durham University who wrote that diary, went all the way to the bottom of this coal mine to write about some tiny little kind of semi-transparent flea, which is only found at the bottom of coal mines.
Yeah, that about sums it up. They are wonderful, the country diaries, and they encompass virtually every aspect of the outdoors world and the outdoor life. Now, there were 2 volumes of them, and a new one's just come out, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the one that caught my imagination last year was the collection of Harry Griffin's diaries, and he'd written them for over 50 years, which is some achievement, and they're fantastic things, and they're certainly slightly different from many of the diaries in that they truly really are a kind of diary of the high crags and the fells of the lakes, aren't they?
Yeah. I mean, Harry was famous as the man who wrote diaries from places that nobody else could reach, or very few other people, and certainly no other journalists on The Guardian. There's one marvellous one about, he had a debate with somebody about the highest building in England, and this other guy came up with somewhere, I think, no doubt in the Lake District, that was a little sort of cabin somewhere, maybe that lodge, Ruthwaite Lodge on the way up Helvellyn, I'm not sure, something like that. But Harry trumped everybody by finding this tiny little smuggler's cave above Bow Fell Buttress, very near the top of Bow Fell, which is about the 4th or 5th highest mountain in England. And he describes it in this diary, how you actually have to back into it. It's so small. You go to the entrance, like a little sentry box, and then you sort of push your bottom in and creep into this thing. And he did the sort of, don't practice this at home kind of thing, because it's quite dangerous, because there's this enormous slab of rock running smoothly down over Escaws, which you could, if you lost your footing, you'd go sliding down there. So Harry's diaries have that kind of extra element to them.
I mean, there's everything in there, isn't there? From skinny dipping in lakes to, I mean, my favourite entry is the one where he complains about losing his bobble hat, which, of course, all of us who've been on the hills have done that from some time to another. The other thing that fascinated me was reading the diaries, which I don't remember at the time, but reading the collection, is actually you go through his life with him, don't you? You see every little twist and turn and tragedy of his life in a way that's expressed through walking and expressed through the countryside, and it's a very rare gift, that, I think.
Well, both of these books have got quite a lot by me. I mean, I edited them, but I couldn't resist the chance to sort of write a bit about them in each case. There's loads of diaries in there, but I've also, in Harry's case, as you say, really done a little sort of mini biography of him, because I was very interested by Harry. I knew him quite well, and he was a very military man. He had an aquiline nose and a big moustache and a crisp, officer-like way of speaking, and he was, in fact, a lieutenant colonel from the war. He was a lieutenant colonel in intelligence. But I was fascinated to discover that he wasn't actually really like that at all initially. His father ran a little shop and kind of decorating business in Barrow in Furness, and Harry left school at the age of 15. I've actually got his school certificate at home, because his daughter's given me various things to do with Harry, like his army uniform and this school certificate and his typewriter, which nobody quite knows what to do with, so at the moment I'm looking after them. And he became a cub reporter on the local newspaper. And so he was a self-made man and also a self-made journalist. And actually, he turned out to be a brilliant journalist, as well as his country diaries are perhaps in a superior vein to journalism. They're more what we would call writing, they're more literary. But I think the real strength of them, and it applies to quite a lot of the other Guardian country diaries, is that as a journalist he was a trained observer, and he noticed things, and he had an eye for a good story, and he was quite ingenious. He used to freelance for the BBC when he was working as a local journalist in Kendal, and the BBC wanted him to do an account of the flooding of the River Kent, which had caused lots of damage in Kendal. But by the time they came on to him, they left it a bit late, because the spate of the river had gone past, so the floods were there. But a flood, a static flood doesn't make very good radio. So Harry thought to himself, and he listened to the noise from the A65 which at that time went through the centre of Kendal and went right outside his office. And he realised that the noise of this traffic sounded very like floodwater. It was kind of noise. So he stuck his BBC microphone outside the window and recorded the traffic, and they played it. Said, then it was, here's Harry Griffin, and I'm looking out over this terrible scene. And he scooped the world on the Bluebird tragedy, when Donald Campbell was killed on Lake Coniston. Well, Harry was there as a journalist, working for the Lancashire Evening Post, and he had a lot of nous. A lot of the journalists went up the lake to watch and photograph the Bluebird speedboat as it came zooming down. But Harry, who knew Donald Campbell and actually went in Bluebird on one of the trials, he reckoned he was the fastest journalist afloat at that time. He stayed at Campbell's base because the radio reports from the Bluebird were coming through to Campbell's caravan, and so he was the first to know that there'd been a disaster. And he also had, crucially for a journalist, all the telecommunications apparatus to immediately ring the BBC and say, this has happened. So he was a scoop man as well as a wildlife man.
he was somebody who cared very passionately about the lakes, but he wrote from other places as well. I mean, most notably Scotland, where he used to be a winter skier. And there's also a series of interesting entries from the Rockies as well, isn't there? And he said everywhere he went, he seemed to stay religiously to his 2-weekly column in the Country Diary in the Guardian. It was fascinating to see that.
He did care very much about the lakes, and he didn't just write about them. He participated in the civic life of the lakes. He sat on a lot of committees, and there's some very good diaries about things like whether they should flood certain valleys, whether electricity should be taken to certain remote valleys. He was very early on in the field on diversification, trying to get a wider range of people to come and enjoy the lakes. So he did all that kind of thing. It was Harry, really, who got the Bob Graham round going, this absolutely fearsome fell race in the Lake District. Well, Harry didn't. Bob Graham was the person who first did it, but Harry publicised it. Actually, not in the Guardian, but in the Lancashire Evening Post, and that got that going. But yeah, he strayed from the lakes. He didn't altogether like doing it. And when he went to Canada on holiday with his family, his daughter Sandra was telling me it was awful because he was in a perpetual state of worry about how he was going to get his column back to the Guardian, because he never missed. In 53 years, he never once missed a column. He's the only diarist never to have done that. So, yeah, he did venture further afield, but at the cost of family, peace and calm.
He used to cut the paper that he typed onto, didn't he, to fit the kind of column dimensions of the newspaper.
Yeah, well, one of the funny things, the Guardian's got a very good archive, which the public are, welcome to use. It's like a public library, and there's some marvellous stuff in there. There's some things in there that I'm quite surprised about, really, because some very intemperate letters from people who are still living about how much they should be paid, Roy Hattersley, and people like that. And there's some furious letters from Harry Griffin, because, as you say, and I've actually got, I've given it or Sandra Griffin has given it to the Fell and Rock Club now, but all his original diaries are extant, and the Guardian kept changing its mind about the length. Sometimes it was 300 words, then a new editor would say no, just 250, or occasionally went up, never much more than 350. And Harry would cut his paper accordingly, so that he knew that when it started coming out of the typewriter drum sort of thing. I mean, people probably don't know what typewriters are now, but in those days it was a typewriter. He was coming to the end of his allotted length. But, as any journalist knows, and people like me are totally hardened to it, so it never even occurs to me to complain about cuts. Things are always cut for newspapers, or very frequently they are, because it's a limited piece of physical space. And there's some marvellous letters from him saying, I resign, I'm absolutely fed up with this, I complain. And in his best Lieutenant Colonel style. And the sort of emollient people at the Guardian kept writing back to him saying, no, Harry, no. In fact, I did it myself. I spoke to him on the phone several times and said, you can't give up, your readers would, it would be terrible. And it was a kind of soft soaping exercise, but that's all he wanted, really. He just wanted somebody to say a big sorry.
Now, he was a contemporary, of course, of Alfred Wainwright, and knew him quite well, I think, and one of the few people that was allowed to go up on the hills with him.
Yes, I don't think Alfred Wainwright particularly liked going on the fells with Harry Griffin. I mean, they didn't really like going on the fells with anybody much except himself, but he did let Harry go with him a few times, because he respected Harry Griffin's knowledge of the fells. And Harry Griffin, was a very formidable rock climber, and Wainwright was an extremely clumsy man. I mean, a wonderful writer, but there are a lot of descriptions of Wainwright, sort of shuffling along in his plimsolls and taking ages to get over quite simple obstacles. But the thing about Harry was he was a terrible talker. He really would go on and on and on. And Wainwright didn't, he liked to have elevated thoughts when he was walking in the hills. So it was only a few times, but there was a slightly funnier episode, actually, when Harry went walking with the editor of the Guardian, a man called Alistair Hetherington, who was 3 editors ago now. He was the editor during the 1950s and 60s, and a very great Guardian editor, and also a fell walker. He wasn't the only Guardian editor to be a fell walker, but he was probably the most enthusiastic fell walker. And Harry left an account of walking up, I think it was Great End or somewhere, part of the Scawfell Massif anyway, with Alistair Hetherington. And Harry was talking all the way, telling Alistair Hetherington things that were wrong with the Guardian. And he says something like, unfortunately the wind was blowing the wrong way, and when we got to the top, or when they got back to the Wastwater Hotel, I think, Alistair told me he only picked up, just hardly any of what I'd been saying, and I'm sure this was tactical.
And he was really a telegraph man, wasn't he, in terms of his own reading, I think?
Yes, I think the only thing he read in The Guardian was his column, which he snipped out and kept in a cuttings book religiously, which I'm glad about, because records like that are very important. And incidentally, his cut-out columns are very funny because he marks in ink all the changes and all the things that The Guardian got wrong, because it had a bad reputation at one time for misprinting and things. But yeah, no, he was a Telegraph and Times man, and he had a friend who was a Labour peer who was from the Lake District. When he was a younger man, I think Harry was a bit more radical, but there's a bit in the book about him talking about something like, that odious little Blair.
that made me smile. That was fantastic.
And that was quite a long time ago. I mean, there's quite a lot of people nowadays who talk about that odious Mr. Blair, having the poor chap's been in power for so long that your popularity cannot last that long, but Harry Griffin was on to him very early on.
Yeah, there's nothing like hill walkers to kind of focus very quickly on all kinds of political deficiencies. I'm just thinking of the current debate about wind turbines and access to lands, and those bunch of people who think we should take all the cairns down off mountains and things like that. And that kind of comes through the Harry stuff, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Harry was very good on people, actually, although his main subject was, I would say, first the landscape, and secondly the wildlife and the flora and fauna. Very close up with that were the sort of personalities, the people he met, including a lot of the campaigners. Lord Burkitt, the lawyer, was somebody he knew quite well. In fact, Lord Burkitt, who was a very, very famous lawyer, like Harry, started off at Barrow-in-Furness Board School, whatever it was called. I think he was a year ahead of Harry. He's the only person to have a fell named after him. Burkitt Fell in the Lake District. It's the only one named after an actual person. But the other character I remember Harry describing, among all these people who played a vigorous part in Lake District life, was a German professor who he met at the Water Hotel when he was a young man. And in those days, that hotel was very famous, a bit like the Penny-Gyrryd in North Wales, for attracting these kind of scholarly climbers. A lot of them were Oxbridge professors, and there was one very famous one whose name I just can't remember now, but who had an artificial leg, and he'd had it specially made so he could rock climb with it. It had sort of hooks and things on it, But this German professor told Harry when he was a young man, he had this theory about when you washed or when you swam in a mountain tarn, which Harry was keen on doing, enjoyed doing, you should never dry yourself, because he said the water goes back in naturally into your body and sort of refreshes you, which I didn't think is true. But
yeah,
very amusing.
The diaries are full of those kind of insights, aren't they? And Harry, as we said, did the diary for over 50 years, and then in that kind of country diary tradition, passed it on, but was very careful about who he passed the tradition on to, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. It wasn't actually in his gift, strictly speaking. I mean, it was really up to the Guardian, but Harry himself had been nominated by a very famous naturalist called George Muller, who was a Quaker man who lived up in the Lake District and was tremendously expert on everything to do with the lake. Especially, he was a great fisherman, and Muller was quite interesting because he got involved with the hunting controversy very early on, and there's some quite interesting correspondence and diaries from him about making the case which hunting people often do make. And I think personally there's a lot in it. I mean, I don't have views either way terribly strongly myself, but Muller's line was always, we are the people who really know what we're talking about, whether it was otters in those days or fox hunting. And of course the Lake District's got the great tradition of foothounds, like the Blencathra foothounds, wonderful. Even if you don't like hunting, I defy you not to find it an incredible sight when you see the foothounds going out on the fell. So this guy Muller had said to the editor of The Guardian before Hetherington, who was a man called A.P. Wadsworth, who was another man who left school at 15, by the way, the only Guardian editor ever to have done that. There's this very promising young writer called Harry Griffin, who works in the lakes, and when I come to give up, which I think I'll be doing soon, he actually carried on like Harry till he died. How about Griffin? So when Griffin became aware that he wasn't going to go on forever. I mean, he was 93, Griffin, when he died. He'd spotted somebody who is the current diarist from the Lake District, Tony Greenbank, who I think is a very worthy successor to Harry Griffin. In some ways, almost better, I think, sometimes. He's got a very nice sense of humour as Tony. And Harry effectively said, at one time, Harry was going to leave him his typewriter. And then Tony Greenbank taught Harry how to use a computer. And from that evolved the fact that Tony didn't want Harry's computer, so I think sort of Harry said, well, you can have my column then. and so it transpired.
Well, we're beginning to move on to talk about the second collection of the Country Diary in general, but just to wrap up these comments about Harry, I mean, there's everything in these contributions, isn't there? There's the excitement of the fells, there's tragedy. I mean, some of the pieces about his personal tragedy in his life, the death of his first wife and the tragic death of his second, are incredible, but somehow they come over in a fascinating way, really, and always expressed in the notion of the outdoors and the lakes.
Yes, that's true. He did suffer great tragedy. I mean, his first marriage lasted for 50 years, just, he had his golden wedding, but he then met a lovely lady called Violet Macaulay, and they got married. In fact, it's funny, Jeanette Page, who edited the Guardian Diary at the time, told me that Violet Macaulay had contacted her to raise the question about whether she was quite an elderly lady herself, certainly over 60 by then, and Harry would be over 70, I think. And Violet Macaulay got in touch with Jeanette about the delicate question of whether they should live together before marriage, because she wasn't at all sure what the families would think. So it's quite interesting. The Guardian was sort of agony on, in this case. But then she died, alas, within 6 months. And then he then had a third companion, a lovely lady called Josie, because Harry couldn't live without female company. It was partly, I'm afraid to say, unromantically practical. I mean, he literally couldn't boil an egg, Harry. And he came from that generation where women were, objects of beauty and grace and so forth, and also able to cook. So Josie lived with him, and then she in turn died, and he was just devastated. But worst of all, and it's a great tribute to how Harry kept his enthusiasm and kept his, just kept going. His son predeceased him, Robin, his son, and I think, I don't know, and I don't think there was ever an inquest, but Robin he was a climber too, and he'd been climbing in the Himalayas, and he went on one of these very high-level, organised climbs that happen nowadays. I forget which peak it was, but it was about 23,000 feet, so it was, really, really high. And the guide got altitude sickness, and Robin Griffin took over as guide, and they went up to the top of the mountain and came back down again. But I believe you don't go to those altitudes without a physical change in your blood, which can take some time to settle down again, and your blood becomes thicker. And Robin, about 6 months after this Himalayan expedition, Robin Griffin had a heart attack and died. And it was just desperate. I mean, it's the sort of thing every parent dreads.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of tragedy in the book, but there's a lot of fantastic uplifting stuff as well, and it's just a wonderful collection. In the foreword, which was written by Chris Bonington, there's a lovely diary entry of Harry going out on the hills one day and only meeting one person all day, and that just happened to be Chris Bonington. But I mean, in it, he talks about, well, maybe we should have a collection of Harry's writing every year, and I think he says that would keep us going for at least 10 years, I think.
Yes, it would. Yeah, because he wrote more than 1,500 of them. So, well, I'm up for that if the Guardian wants to.
Well, I know that everybody that I know has read that book has absolutely been enthralled with it. And so, if you haven't read this yet, the Lifetime of the Mountains, it's called, the best of A. Harry Griffin's Country Diary, you should rush out and buy it this Christmas. It is the most fantastic book, and undoubtedly deserves its accolade as probably the best walking book last year, I think. Well, that just about wraps up this first in the two-part conversation about the Guardian Country Diaries. I've been talking to Martin Wainwright about A Lifetime of Mountains, the best of A. Harry Griffin's Country Diaries. In the second part of our conversation, I talked to Martin about A Gleaming Landscape, a second collection of Guardian Country Diaries that's recently been published to rave reviews. I also talked to Martin about his forthcoming book on the Coast to Coast Walk. Until then, this is Andy Howell saying take care and happy hiking.
My thanks go to Andy once again for making the book club what it is and go from strength to strength with some really interesting interviews. There'll be much more from him very soon. Until then, this is Bob Cartwright at theoutdoorstation.co.uk. The new name, theoutdoorstation.co.uk, beavering away in the background and trying to keep it all together.